Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 213 and it's titled Don't Get Addicted to Shuffling. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Anchor over on Reddit, and that card is River Song. And River Song is 1 blue red for a 2/2 legendary creature human Time Lord rogue, and she has meat in reverse. You draw cards from the bottom of your library rather than the top, and spoilers, whenever an opponent scries, surveils, or searches their library, put a +1/+1 counter on River Song, then River Song deals damage to that player equal to its power. Now, the unspoken rule on the channel is, of course, if we have a legendary creature as our random card, then it does have to be our commander, so River Song is going to be our commander this week, so we are working with an Is-It deck and trying to build around her as best as we can. Now, with that being said, though, let's jump into some of our themes, kind of break down what we're trying to do with this deck, and talk about what makes it work. So our very first theme is going to be forced searching, and if we're being perfectly honest, there's not a ton of ways in Magic to make your opponents search their libraries, but there are a lot of cards that say each player or target player may search their library, and that is kind of what we're trying to take advantage of here. And an example of this is Noble Benefactor. Noble Benefactor is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 cleric. If Noble Benefactor is put into any graveyard from play, each player may search their library for any one card and put that card into their hand. Each player who searches their library shuffles it afterwards. So this puts us in a situation where if we have River Song, our opponents can choose to search their library when the Noble Benefactor dies, but if they search their library for a card, they are guaranteed to be taking damage from River Song. So we get to search for free, River Song's never going to affect us, but our opponents have to make the decision of do they want to search and take the damage, or do they choose not to search and miss out on some value. So like I said, there's not really a way to force our opponents to search, but we can at least put them in a situation where they have to make a decision whether or not they really want to. It's not all upside. That is, though, only our first theme, so the next theme that we're going to take a look at is going to be kind of a group hug synergy, focusing on helping our opponents to draw cards. And a good way we can do that is with cards like Dictate of Crufix, which is 1 blue for an enchantment. It has flash, and at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. And you may be wondering, why would we want our opponents to be drawing cards? And because if we look at River Song and what she does, we kind of just want her to be sitting in play while our opponents play out their game plans. Because we are hurting our opponents whenever they scry, surveil, or search their libraries, which are very common things to happen in a game of Commander. So if we can pretend to kind of be a sort of group hug deck, then our opponents aren't going to be as likely to destroy the things that we need to keep our deck running, and at the same time, we are going to be providing enough value to the rest of the table while not looking like much of a threat, so that hopefully our opponents use any removal spells on each other. Maybe they're focused on casting things to outlast the other opponents, and then we're able to just kind of close out the game by having our commander in play. So it's a little bit of a stretch of a game plan, but in my experience, I've seen a lot of group hug synergies win in this sort of way because people just like to draw cards and they don't typically want to hurt the person that's helping them draw their cards. Moving on to our final theme of the deck, this is where we get to punishing our opponent's card draw. Obviously, we have River Song, which is a great way for us to benefit from our opponents playing out their game plan, but she's just one card. We need some other ways to do that as well. And if we're helping our opponents draw so many cards with things like Dictate of Crufix, we may as well also use cards like Scrawling Crawler to punish that card draw. And the Crawler is 3 mana for a 3/2 artifact creature Phyrexian Construct. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card. So once again, more card draw, more group hug. But Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player loses 1 life. So if we can stack up enough card draw effects, our opponents might be drawing 3-4 cards a turn, and while losing 3 or 4 life doesn't sound like too much when you start at 40, it really adds up over the course of the game, especially because we do have ways in the deck to essentially wheel, making every player discard their hand or shuffle it in and draw 7 new cards, so we can kind of trip up their game plans. We can make sure that we're punishing that card draw, while at the same time still providing them the opportunity to forward their game plans, forward their strategies, and hopefully wind up getting burned out by River Song. So that is our themes for this week. That is what we're trying to do. And the next thing we're going to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do, and in some cases can be win conditions or value engines all on their own. So the very first card we're going to talk about is going to be Psychogenic Probe. And Psychogenic Probe is 2 mana for an artifact. Whenever a spell or ability causes a player to shuffle their library, Psychogenic Probe deals 2 damage to them. So we have a lot of ways in the deck to force our opponents to shuffle, and while River Song doesn't specifically trigger on shuffling, she only triggers on searching, being able to make our opponents shuffle can still play into a couple of different cards we have in the deck. And of course, if you're searching your library, then you're also going to be shuffling, and that involves things like ramping. So if someone cultivates or ramping growths, if someone tutors with a demonic tutor, all of these are going to trigger Psychogenic Probe and also trigger River Song. So this puts us in a position where we're really punishing our opponents for doing things that we don't want them to be doing, and it helps us advance our game plan because we can continuously force our opponents to shuffle their libraries and then burn them out with the Psychogenic Probe. Moving on to our next key card, which is actually very similar to Psychogenic Probe. It's Widespread Panic. And Widespread Panic is 2 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a spell or ability causes its controller to shuffle their library, that player puts a card from their hand on top of their library. So we are able to, once again, make our opponents shuffle their decks quite a bit, and every time they're going to be shuffling their deck, they have to essentially discard a card. It doesn't go to the graveyard, it goes to the top of their deck, but in some ways that's actually better for us. There are decks that obviously rely on graveyard synergies. This doesn't help them with that. But what it does do is essentially sets them back a turn, because now they have to draw the card that they just put on top, and if they're not drawing a whole new hand, that can essentially time walk them. It can set them back an entire turn, which is something that a lot of decks may not be able to come back from. So if we can kind of lock our opponents in that way, we can really control the state of the board, and we can then continue to make our opponents shuffle, continue to have them put cards on top, and hopefully continue to punish them with cards like Psychogenic Probe, Scrawling Crawler, or River Song. Moving on to our third and final key card. For this one, we have Molten Psyche. Molten Psyche is probably the go-to win condition in this deck because of all of our card draw effects. Molten Psyche is 1 red for a sorcery. Each player shuffles the cards from their hand into their library, then draws that many cards, but most importantly, it also has Metalcraft. So if we control 3 or more artifacts, Molten Psyche deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of cards that player has drawn this turn. If we can force our opponents to continuously shuffle their hand in or discard their hand and draw a bunch of cards, or maybe they're drawing from our group hug synergies, there are worlds in which we cast this and each opponent takes 7, 14, 21 damage, because it's not difficult for us to hit Metalcraft. We have quite a few ways of making artifacts. A lot of our synergy pieces are artifacts. And this is one of those cards that we can find ways to recur from our graveyard. There's also ways that we can put it on the bottom of our deck. There's a lot we can do with Molten Psyche to win the game, especially if we have these wheel effects, we have these draw effects, and it really puts us in a situation where our deck just kind of outvalues the rest of the table, and while our opponents think that we're helping them, we're actually setting them up to just get burnt out by a single card. But That is the end of our key card section, and the next thing I want to do is take a look at some cool interactions. These are cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do, and in some cases are just fun and cool cards that I really want to highlight because I think that they showcase interactions that I would like to show off about the deck. The first interaction I want to talk about is going to be between Descent into Avernus and Minds Aglow. And really quickly, if you haven't played Descent into Avernus in Commander yet, it is legitimately one of my favorite cards. I put it in almost every red deck if I can. It is unfortunate that it is about $6 now, but if you haven't played it, try it out. It makes games a ton of fun. But it is 2 and a red for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put 2 Descent counters on Descent into Avernus. Then each player creates X treasure tokens, and Descent into Avernus deals X damage to each player, where X is the number of Descent counters on Descent into Avernus. So it's a lot of words, but basically at the beginning of your turn you put 2 counters on it, and then everybody makes treasures and takes damage equal to the counters on it. So the first turn that it comes back around, it's 2, then 4, 6, 8, and so on. This is one of those cards that really speeds up the game because people are very excited to get the treasures, and we kind of overlook the damage that it does. But because we're giving so many people treasures, we can actually use that to our advantage with something like Minds Aglow. And Minds Aglow is 1 blue for a sorcery, and it has Join Forces. So starting with you, each player may pay any amount of mana, and then each player draws X cards, where X is the total amount of mana paid this way. So we could set ourselves up in a situation, say it's the first time we get back to Descent into Avernus, we can then make 2 treasures for everyone at the table, cast Minds Aglow, try to talk our opponents into using their treasures for it. If everybody does, that's 8 cards that everybody draws. At that point, everybody has at least 8 cards in their hand, possibly more. So if we were to cast, say, Molten Psyche, we would shuffle our cards back in, draw at least 8, again, possibly more, and then each opponent's going to take 8 plus damage times 2, considering they've done this twice, and this could put us in a situation to just win the game. Now, obviously, you would need to make Metalcraft, so you might want to hang on to some of your treasures or anything else, or even wait until you're getting 4 or 6 treasures a turn. But either way, this combination is very difficult for people to resist. Once you give them free mana, they typically want to use it. You can just straight up turn it into card draw, which is very powerful. And being able to get the entire table to do this is a very quick way for us to just execute our game plan, do what we want to do, and hopefully win with some burn from Riversong. But we still got one more cool interaction to talk about. So moving on to our next cool interaction, this one we have Time Stream Navigator and Swiftfoot Boots. And I know this is a bit of a weird interaction because it's not often that Swiftfoot Boots is mentioned, considering it's just kind of a staple in most decks. But this is the only infinite combo in the entire deck, and for it to work, we need to be able to give the Time Stream Navigator haste, which is exactly why we have Swiftfoot Boots. Because Swiftfoot Boots, simply just 2 mana for an artifact equipment, equipped creature has hexproof and haste, and it equips for 1. I didn't want to go super overboard with an infinite combo, so I didn't want to include a lot of ways to actually activate it. So Swiftfoot Boots is the only way to give haste in the entire deck. So if you do want to activate this combo, you will need both pieces. The other half of this combo, though, is Time Stream Navigator, which is 1 and a blue for a 1/1 human pirate wizard. She has Ascend, so if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the city's blessing. And then you can pay 2 blue and tap her to put Time Stream Navigator on the bottom of its owner's library, take an extra turn after this one, activate only if you have the city's blessing. So you may remember, Riversong lets us draw cards from the bottom of our library, not the top. So if we activate Time Stream Navigator, we're going to take an extra turn, put the Navigator on the bottom of our library, and then when we pass to our next turn with Riversong, we will then draw the Time Stream Navigator that we just put on the bottom, we can cast it, and we would obviously just have to pass after that point, But if we can give the navigator haste, we can again immediately activate her. Now, part of the tricky part of this is that we're not drawing any additional cards. We will always draw the Time Stream Navigator, but hopefully we have enough card draw effects in our deck that that's not going to be too much of an issue. And additionally, we do have to activate this pretty late in the game because we will need the mana to cast Time Stream Navigator, equip Time Stream Navigator, and then activate Time Stream Navigator. So we'll need a total of 7 mana just to be able to pull this combo off. So it is definitely a late game thing, but I know infinite turns can definitely be a downside for people playing Magic, so I did want to highlight this. If this is a combo that you would like to include, but maybe you just don't want it to be infinite, you can just remove the Swiftfoot Boots, make sure that there's no haste, and then it can't possibly be infinite. You just get an extra turn every other turn. But with all that being said, those are all of our cool interactions for this week. And the next thing we're going to do is take a look at the price of the deck. And this week we came incredibly close to our budget limit at $99.79, just barely short of our $100 budget limit. And the most expensive card in the entire deck is actually one of my personal favorites. It is Hivemind at $8.60. And Hivemind is 5 and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, each other player copies that spell. Each of those players may choose new targets for their copy. Now, initially, this doesn't look like it synergizes really well with what our deck is trying to do. But you have to keep in mind what I said earlier is that it's very difficult to force our opponents to do things that we want them to do with Riversong. It's very unlikely we can force our opponents to search their decks, very unlikely we can force them to scry or force them to surveil. Almost every single time those words are stapled to a card, and it's not referring to you as the person casting it, it's almost always a may effect. Our opponents can say no to it. However, if someone casts a spell that simply says, say, scry 2, then draw a card, and every other player casts it, because Hivemind is not a may, they have to copy the spell, they have to cast it, then every player now has to scry 2 and draw a card. So that is going to activate Riversong once for each opponent, dish out a ton of damage, plus we're drawing additional cards. This also helps with things like board wipes if someone has any sort of removal effect. If anyone has any protection effects, it really just kind of changes the dynamics of the game, which is a little bit what we want. We kind of want to disrupt and then eventually win with Riversong. So being able to make people think twice about casting a removal spell, because now, yeah, you might destroy the thing you want to destroy, but all 3 of your opponents also get that same removal spell. So it's something you really have to consider when you're casting things and when you're playing out your game plan, which is kind of what we want. So that is why I think Hivemind does deserve a spot in the deck. It actually does a lot more than you think it would. However, if you do need to trim for budget purposes, this is a card you can cut. There's plenty of other cards that care about shuffling, scrying, searching, surveilling that you could replace it with. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit outside of our budget range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. And this week, the card I would recommend putting into the deck is Niv Mizzet Visionary. And I'll be perfectly honest, I completely forgot this card even existed. I know it just came out in Foundations, which I guess is technically 3 sets ago now, which is wild. But I forgot that this Niv Mizzet existed, and it's perfect for our deck because it's 4 blue-red for a 5/5 legendary creature dragon wizard. It has flying, gives us no maximum hand size, and whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you draw that many cards. Riversong is dealing non-combat damage, and the smallest amount of non-combat damage she can do regarding anything else that's going on the board is 3, which means that if we can, say, force all of our opponents to search their libraries for a card, Riversong will deal 3 damage to one opponent, 4 damage to another, and then 5 damage to the third opponent, effectively drawing us a total of 11 cards. If I did my math right, it might be more. But that is an incredible amount of value from just a single 6-drop. And yes, it is 6 mana, it is very expensive, but I do genuinely believe that it is worth it. And I haven't tested the deck with Niv Mizzet in the deck, but if someone else does, I would love to hear stories about its success or maybe even its failures, but it seems perfect for what we're trying to do, in my opinion. However, that being said, if you do put a card into the deck, obviously you have to take a card out of the deck. And in this case, I would recommend taking out Eager Construct, which is 2 mana for a 2/2 artifact creature construct. When it enters the battlefield, each player may scry 1. Now, this is a card that when I put it in, I was like, oh, this is perfect. Each player's scrying. But after actually playing with the deck, I realized that it's not as good as it looks on the surface, mainly because it is a May trigger. Not every opponent has to scry 1. And if River Song's in play, scrying 1 really isn't worth it if you're about to take 3, 4, 5 plus damage, and it's just a 2 mana 2/2. Typically, we would want to play this early before River Song hits the board, or once she's already hit the board, then it turns into how late do we have to wait to get that scry effect to be worth it. We want our opponents to take the damage, but again, they're not going to choose to take the damage over the scry most of the time. And if they're not really taking the damage, then do we really just want to be playing a 2 mana 2/2 that lets us scry 1 when we could have a 6 mana 5/5 that essentially just draws our entire deck? A little bit of a trade-off, but I do think that that would be the cut I would make. Obviously, it's not a terrible card to include if you still need to include it. But with all of that being said, before we move on to the game with this deck, because we do have to test out how this deck actually performs in a game, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. As always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. But if you're looking to go a little bit above and beyond, we have a couple of ways for you to do that as well. The first is through our Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. Both of those are going to get you access to a ton of extra stuff like the deck lists a week early, access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games that appear on the channel. So if you want to be a part of an amazing community, that is a great way to do it. And you also get the guarantee from me that any of your suggestions will be turned into videos eventually. Might take me a while because I work a little bit slow, but I will get to them. And you can also get the unedited gameplay videos and a card sent to you every single month that is one of the random cards that we build around, plus some awesome hand-drawn tokens that are maybe a little bit weird, but I do my best. So that is something else that you can look forward to. But as always, I do want to shout out our current patrons and channel members, so a massive thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Huey, Ryder Cole, Jeffrey Boos, Vintage, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Jakar, Galen, Brian Holiday, Richard, The Oak Monster, and Tuku Spooner. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support, and without any further ado, let's check out how our Don't Get Addicted to Shuffling Riversong deck performs in a game. So as always, this week we are joined by 3 opponents, and in this case it is Josh playing Hashatan Scarab's Fist, Doodle playing Gilwaine Casting Director, and Cole playing Judith Carnage Connoisseur. Starting off with Josh, this is kind of the stock precon for Hashatan with some upgrades that he's been able to pull from recent sets or that he had laying around. He didn't really go out and purchase a lot of upgrades for this. I think he got a couple, but it was really intended to just be kind of a value style deck. He wants to discard a bunch of cards, turn them into zombies, and I think the interesting thing about Hashatan that I'm sure Josh will take advantage of because he's a great deck builder is the fact that Hashatan doesn't exile the card that you make a copy of. So if you can discard it and then return it to your hand and discard it again, you can continuously make copies of the same card. And I have no doubt that Josh has some really powerful enter the battlefield effects in this deck that we really have to watch out for. Moving on to Doodle and his Gilwaine deck. This is the deck that I'm probably the most concerned about, mainly because I have a very healthy fear of enchantment decks. And yes, this is an aura deck. He wants to put rolls on things. I believe he mentioned that he usually wants to do the royal roll. That's at least what he did last time we played this deck. But there are a lot of cards that benefit you if you play auras or play enchantments, and green and white are very powerful in Commander, especially when combined. So I know that he's got ways to ramp. I'm sure he's got ways to make a massive board. I wouldn't be surprised if he can very quickly overwhelm the rest of the table, and especially because Doodle has a history of having very unique and powerful decks. And especially in the Selesnya colors, it seems like every Selesnya deck he's got is super creative, super unique, and super powerful. So that is probably the one that I'm the most concerned about. Moving on to our last opponent, we have Cole with Judith. This is kind of a unique take on Judith. A lot of the decks that I've seen with Judith in the past focus a lot on the Death Touch and Lifelink ability that she has, but I believe Cole is actually focusing on the Imp creature. So he wants to cast a spell, make an imp, and then use that imp kind of as fodder that he can sacrifice to cast more spells. So there's a lot of spells in Magic that say you can sacrifice a creature to draw 2 cards. And in this way, he's able to make an imp, sacrifice it, do 2 damage to each opponent, replace the imp, and draw cards. So it's a very unique take on Judith that I think is really cool and probably very powerful if he can get the engine rolling. So I'm very excited to see what he can do with it, and if we're being honest, a little bit concerned as well. But those are our opponents for this week. I would love to know down in the comments what your prediction is. Please let me know who you think is going to walk out the winner this week. And of course, we are also an option. I notice a lot of times people don't think that we are going to win, but hey, you never know. I could get there someday. So let me know what you think. Otherwise, if there's any suggestions you have for the deck list as well, then we'll check that out. So please let me know that. But otherwise, let's jump into this game, see how we do, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Josh goes first, followed by Doodle, myself, and then Cole. On Josh's first turn, he plays an Arcane Sanctum. Doodle plays a Forest. I play a Mad Blind Mountain. Cole plays a Mountain. Josh plays an Island and casts Undertaker, letting him pay a black mana and tap it to discard a card and return a creature from his graveyard to his hand. Doodle plays a Plains, and then casts Dranith Magistrate, preventing his opponents from casting spells from anywhere other than their hands. I play a Mountain and cast a Soul Ring, then also cast a Temple Bell, which can be tapped to make each player draw a card. Cole plays a Swamp and casts Felwar Stone. Josh plays an Exotic Orchard and casts his own Soul Ring. Doodle plays a Forest and casts his commander, Gilwain Casting Director, now creating his choice of a Royal, Sorcerer, or Monster Role token attached to each non-token creature that enters under his control. When Gilwain enters, Doodle has him enter with a Royal Roll, giving him +1/+1 and Ward 1. He then moves to combat and attacks Cole for 1 with the Magistrate, and at the end of turn, I activate Temple Bell, making each player draw a card. On my turn, I cast Surly Badgersaur, putting a +1/+1 counter on it whenever I discard a creature, making a treasure token when I discard a land, and having it fight target creature when I discard a non-creature non-land. Then I play an Is It Boilerworks, returning a mountain to my hand. Cole plays a Mountain and casts Viscera Seer, letting him sacrifice a creature to scry 1. Then, at the end of turn, Josh basic land cycles and Ash Barrens, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand, and still at the end of turn, Josh casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Doodle's Dranith Magistrate, letting him gain 1 life since the Magistrate had 1 power. On Josh's turn, he plays a Plains and casts his commander Hashaton Scarab's Fist, letting him pay 3 mana when he discards a creature card to create a token copy of it except as a 4/4 zombie. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Toski, Bearer of Secrets, entering with a Royal Roll, now letting him draw a card whenever a creature he controls deals combat damage to an opponent. This lets him attack Josh for 3 with Gilwain, drawing a card, and at the end of turn, I activate Temple Bell, making each player draw another card. On my turn, I play a command tower and cast Hive Mind. So now, whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery, each other player copies that spell and can choose new targets for the copy. Cole plays a command tower and casts his commander Judith Carnage Connoisseur. Now, whenever he casts an instant or sorcery, he can either give the spell Death Touch and Lifelink, or create a 2/2 Imp creature token that does 2 damage to each opponent when it dies. Josh plays a Sunken Hollow and casts Psychic Frog, which draws a card when it deals combat damage to an opponent, and lets Josh discard a card to put a +1/+1 counter on it. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Halvar, God of Battle, entering with a Royal Roll and giving his creatures that are enchanted or equipped Double Strike. This lets him attack Josh for 6 with Gilwain and attack Cole for 4 with Toski. Before damage though, Josh uses Psychic Frog to discard Scion of Darkness, putting a +1/+1 counter on it. And then once that's resolved, he also activates Undertaker, discarding Angel of Ruins to return the Scion he just discarded to his hand, also paying for Hashatan's ability, creating a tap token copy of the Angel, exiling both Royal Rolls attached to Doodle's attackers. This means Josh only takes 2, Cole takes 1, and Doodle draws 2 cards. At the end of turn, I activate Temple Bell, making each player draw a card. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast Descent into Avernus, putting 2 Descent counters on it in my upkeep, and then each player makes treasure tokens and takes damage equal to the number of counters on it. After that, I cast my commander, Riversong, now drawing cards from the bottom of my library instead of the top, putting a +1/+1 counter on her whenever an opponent scries, surveils, or searches their library, and then doing damage to that opponent equal to her power. Cole casts Glimpse of the Impossible, creating a 2/2 Imp token with Judith, exiling the top 3 cards of his library, being able to play them until the next end step, and if any of those cards remain exiled at the end of turn, putting them into his graveyard and making an Eldrazi spawn token for each one put into his graveyard this way. Additionally, thanks to Hive Mind, each of his opponents also copy the spell. Once that's resolved, he plays a Swamp and casts Village Rites, sacrificing his Imp token to draw 2. This does 2 damage to each opponent, makes him another Imp, and then each opponent copies the spell, also drawing 2. After that, Cole casts Costly Plunder, sacrificing his Imp token to draw 2, doing 2 damage to each opponent, making another Imp, and then each opponent copies the spell, also drawing 2. Finally, he moves to his end step, with each player putting their exiled cards into their graveyards, making Cole 2 spawn tokens while everyone else makes 3. On Josh's turn, he plays an Accursed Dunyard, casts Talisman of Hierarchy and Talisman of Dominance, and then sacrifices 2 of his spawn to cast Renewed Solidarity, naming Zombie as it enters to give his zombies +1/+0, and at the beginning of his end step, creating a token copy of each zombie token that entered under his control that turn. Then he activates Psychic Frog, discarding a Wonder, putting a +1/+1 counter on the frog. Now that Wonder's in his graveyard and he controls an island, all of his creatures have flying. This lets him attack Cole for 8 with Angel of the Ruins and Psychic Frog, drawing a card, and in his second main phase, Josh sacrifices his final Eldrazi spawn to cast the Underworld Cookbook, which can be tapped to let him discard a card and make a food token. Doodle plays a Horizon Canopy and sacrifices 2 spawn tokens to cast Archon of Sun's Grace, entering with a Royal Roll, giving his Pegasus creatures lifelink and creating a 2/2 Pegasus token whenever an enchantment enters under his control, which he does immediately thanks to the roll. After that, he casts Destiny Spinner, preventing his creatures and enchantments from being countered, entering with a Royal Roll and making 2 more Pegasus tokens. Then he casts a Sanctum Weaver, entering with a Royal Roll, creating 2 more Pegasus tokens, and it can tap to make mana equal to the number of enchantments he controls. Finally, he attacks Josh with Toski and Halvar for 9, but before damage, Josh activates Underworld Cookbook, making a food, discarding All-Seeing Arbiter, paying for Hashatan to create a tapped token copy of it. When the Arbiter enters or attacks, Josh draws 2 and discards a card, also giving a creature -X/-0 until his next turn, where X is the number of different mana values among cards in his graveyard. With this trigger, he can give Halvar -6/-0, paying for ward, and block Toski with Hashaton, taking no damage. At the end of turn, I activate Temple Bell, making each player draw a card. Then in my upkeep, I put 2 Descent counters on Descent into Avernus, doing 2 damage to each player and letting everyone make 2 treasures. After that, I play an island and cast Razorkin Needlehead, doing 1 damage to an opponent whenever they draw a card. After that, I cast Noble Benefactor, which lets each player search their libraries for a card and put it into their hand when it dies. Once that's resolved, I cast Step Between Worlds, letting each player shuffle their hand and graveyard into their libraries to draw 7. Thanks to Hivemind, each of my opponents also copy the spell, putting 4 copies of it on the stack. However, since it's not required, I wind up being the only player who shuffles their hand in to draw 7 new cards, but I do it twice so I have a decent hand. Cole plays a Haunted Ridge and casts Dire Sight, making an Imp token, surveilling 2, drawing 2, and losing 2 life. This gets copied by each opponent and also triggers River Song. This means that River Song winds up getting 3 +1/+1 counters, I lose 2 life, Doodle loses 7, Josh loses 8, and Cole loses 9. Once that's resolved, Cole casts Go for the Throat, destroying my Noble Benefactor. This is also copied by each player, so I target Hashaton, Doodle targets the Needlehead, and Josh targets Halvar. With all those spells on the stack, I activate Temple Bell, making each player draw a card and doing 1 more damage to each opponent. At this point, mine and Doodle's copies of Go for the Throat resolve, destroying Hashaton and the Needlehead, but before Josh's can resolve, Doodle casts Teferi's Protection, forcing each of his opponents to also copy it. This means that everyone's permanents all phase out, we gain protection from everything, and our life totals can't change until the beginning of our next turns. Once again, with all the spells on the stack, Cole casts Nasty End, making an Imp token, sacrificing an Imp, doing 2 damage to each opponent, and drawing 2 cards. Since the rest of us haven't phased out yet, we all copy it, also drawing 2. When Josh untaps, all of his permanents phase in, then he plays a Prairie Stream and recasts his commander Hashaton. Then, rather than discarding to hand size, he discards 4 cards to Psychic Frog, putting 4 +1/+1 counters on it. When Doodle untaps for his turn, his permanents phase back in, then he plays a Forest and casts Surak and Goreclaw, giving his creatures Trample, and whenever another non-token creature enters under his control, it gets a +1/+1 counter and haste until the end of turn. It also enters with a Royal Roll. After that, he casts Temur Sabertooth, also entering with a Royal Roll, and letting him pay 2 mana to return another creature he controls to his hand, giving the Sabertooth indestructible until the end of turn. With this, he has just enough mana left to return Sanctum Weaver to his hand and recast it, being able to immediately tap it thanks to Surak and Goreclaw, demonstrating a loop that will give him infinite mana. However, when Doodle goes to recast Sanctum Weaver for the first time, Josh casts Frantic Search, drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, and untapping 3 lands. At this point, we had become so accustomed to having the Hivemind that we all also copy Frantic Search, drawing 2, discarding 2, and untapping 3 lands, but this is the only point where we forget that the Hivemind is phased out, but by the time we realize it, we're well past the point of rewinding, so we live with this mistake. When Josh discards, he activates Hashaton to create a token copy of Shefet Archfiend, giving all other creatures -2/-2 until the end of turn, killing Toski and Doodle's Pegasus tokens. Then the Sanctum Weaver resolves, and Doodle activates the Sabertooth to return the Weaver to his hand, but in response, Josh discards Ashen Rider, and then pays for Hashaton to make a copy of it, exiling Temur Sabertooth. In response, Doodle casts Everybody Lives, giving all creatures hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn, giving all players hexproof until the end of turn, preventing players from losing life this turn, and preventing players from winning or losing the game. With his board finally safe, Doodle is able to use Sanctum Weaver and Temur Sabertooth to generate infinite mana. With that, he's able to cast Rumor Gatherer, scrying 1 whenever a creature enters under his control and drawing a card the second time that ability resolves this turn. Since he's also getting infinite enter the battlefield triggers off Sanctum Weaver, he draws a card and scries one as many times as he wants. Once he's finished scrying, he casts Rishkar's Expertise, drawing 7 cards since he controls a creature with 7 power, and casting Kutsil Malamet Exemplar for free, preventing his opponents from casting spells on his turn. Finally, he's able to cast Eidolon of Blossoms, drawing a card whenever it or another enchantment enters under his control, effectively letting him draw his entire deck. This allows him to cast just about anything he wants, but the most important things are Eternal Witness, returning Everybody Lives from his graveyard to his hand, and Thought Vessel gaining no maximum hand size. When I untap for my turn, all my permanents phase back in, then in my upkeep I put 2 counters on Descent into Avernus, doing 4 damage to each player except for Cole, and then everyone makes 4 treasures. After that I play a Demolition Field and cast Wheel of Misfortune, which is copied by each of my opponents. This has each of us secretly choosing a number, with each player who chooses the highest number taking that much damage, and each player who didn't choose the lowest number discard their hand and draw 7 new cards. Doodle and I both choose 0, keeping our hands, while Josh chooses 2, discarding his hand and drawing 7, and Cole chooses 19, discarding his hand, drawing 7, and taking 19 damage, but since his life total can't change, he stays at 19 life. Notably, Josh discards Sphinx of the Second Sun here, paying with Hashiton to create a token copy of it, now giving him an additional beginning phase after his post-combat main phase. We continue to repeat this process with the remaining 3 copies of Wheel of Misfortune, with Doodle and I choosing 0 each time, Cole choosing 19, and Josh choosing 3. This means that Cole and Josh both discard their hands 3 more times, and draw 7 cards another 3 times. Once all of that has resolved, I cast Molten Psyche, making each player shuffle their hand into their library, draw that many, then each of my opponents take damage equal to the number of cards they've drawn this turn. Each of my opponents also copy the Molten Psyche, and in response, Doodle casts Reprieve, targeting my copy of the Psyche in an attempt to counter it. This also gets copied for each player, so my copy of Reprieve targets Josh's Reprieve, Cole's copy also targets Josh's, and Josh's targets his own Molten Psyche. Since the spells resolve in reverse turn order, Josh returns Molten Psyche to his hand and draws a card, fizzling Cole's Reprieve, my Reprieve, and then Doodle's Reprieve resolves, drawing a card and returning the original Molten Psyche to my hand. Finally, to end the chaos, and also save his and Josh's lives, Doodle recast Everybody Lives, which is copied by each other player. In response, Josh discards a card with Psychic Frog, putting a counter on it, and paying for Hashiton, creating a token copy of O'Hare Tok Deepest Foundation, tripling the tokens that would be created under his control. Then all copies on the stack resolve. Now that everything has resolved, I cast Bralin Sky Shark Rider, which gets a +1/+1 counter and does 1 damage to each of my opponents whenever I discard a card. At the end of turn, I have to discard the hand size, discarding 3 cards, making 3 treasures, putting 3 counters on Bralin, and doing 3 damage to each opponent, but because of Everybody Lives, they take no damage. When Cole untaps for his turn, all his permanents phase in, and he then casts Read the Bones, making an imp, scrying 2, drawing 2, and losing 2 life. Each of his opponents also copy the spell, and each one triggers River Song, meaning she gets 3 more +1/+1 counters, I draw 2 and lose 2, Doodle draws 2 and loses 8, Josh draws 2 and loses 9, and Cole draws 2 and loses 10. After that, Cole casts Crackling Spellsinger, giving the next spell he casts Storm. This spell winds up being Deadly Dispute, sacrificing his imp, doing 2 damage to each opponent, making another imp, drawing 2 cards, and making a treasure token. Thanks to Storm, he copies the dispute 2 additional times, making 2 more treasures and drawing 4 cards. Each of his opponents also copy the spell, drawing 2 and making a treasure. As a side note here, I believe the copies that the rest of the table get should also have Storm, but I'm not 100% on that, and we played it as though they didn't, so please let me know in the comments if you know how this interaction would work. Once that's resolved, Cole cast a Tragic Slip, giving Noble Benefactor -13/13 and making an imp token. Each other player also copies the spell, with Josh targeting Bralin, Doodle targeting the Benefactor, and me targeting Surak and Goreclaw. All the targets are killed by the spell, and when the Noble Benefactor dies, each player may search their libraries for a card and put it into their hands. Only Cole and I choose to search, but unfortunately, thanks to Riversong, this puts a counter on her, dealing 9 damage to Cole and knocking him out of the game. At the end of turn, Josh activates Undertaker, discarding a card to return Massacre Worm from his graveyard to his hand. Then on his turn, he plays a Swamp and activates the Cookbook, discarding Massacre Worm, and pays for Hashaton, making 3 token copies of it. When the copies enter, they give each creature his opponent's control -2/-2, and make his opponents lose 2 life whenever one of their creatures die. In response, I sacrifice my 3 Eldrazi Scions, then the worms resolve, giving everything -6/-6. Before that resolves though, Doodle flashes in Village Bellringer, untapping all of his creatures. This, combined with Sanctum Weaver and Temur Sabertooth, again gives him infinite mana. With that mana, he can cast Generous Gift, destroying Massacre Worm and giving 3/3 Elephant tokens to Josh. He also cast a Path to Exile, exiling another Massacre Worm token, letting Josh search his library for a basic land, which he opts not to do. Josh and I also both get copies of the 2 removal spells, targeting creatures on Doodle's board, but before they can resolve, he uses his infinite mana to return all his creatures to his hand with Temur Sabertooth. The final Massacre Worm still sees my Surly Badgersword die, so I lose 2 life, and Doodle keeps Champion of Lamholt, Gilwain, and Karametra God of Harvests. After that, Josh moves to combat, but before he can declare attacks, I sacrifice Demolition Field to destroy his Prairie Stream, letting us both search our libraries for a basic land, but he chooses not to, while I put mine into play tapped. Also before attacks, Doodle cast a Chroma's Will, giving his creatures Flying, Vigilance, Double Strike, Lifelink, Indestructible, and Protection from all colors. Then he also recast Village Bellringer, and still before attacks, Josh activates Undertaker, discarding a card to return Massacre Worm from his graveyard to his hand, discarding again with Psychic Frog, and paying for Hashaton to make 3 more copies of it. When they enter, they once again give all of his opponent's creatures -6/-6, killing Riversong, Gilwain, and the Bellringer. Since there are now 4 Massacre Worms, I lose 8 life, and Doodle loses 16, knocking him out of the game. This allows Josh to attack me with his entire board, attempting to win the game, but unfortunately for him, I cast the Aetherize that I tutored for with the Noble Benefactor, returning all attacking creatures to their owner's hands, keeping me in the game. This also means that when it becomes my turn, I put 2 counters on Descent into Avernus, making each player make 6 treasures and take 6 damage, knocking Josh out and winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. I'm not gonna lie to you, that game ended on turn 8, but I had 2 hours of footage that was recorded for that game. It took us so long to resolve all of our triggers and deal with all the spells that came out of Hivemind. So if you're not a person who is on the Patreon or a channel member that is getting access to the unedited gameplay and you would like to start, this would be a great one to start with, because if you've ever wanted to see 4 Magic players trying to figure out how the stack works, this is the game for you, because we spent so long trying to figure out what was happening, how to resolve it, and we probably messed things up along the way. So if we did make mistakes, please let me know in the comments. I would love to be able to make sure that I don't make those same mistakes in the future, especially because Riversong, I believe, according to one of our members of the Discord Vintage, is probably going to be a regular deck that shows up. Now, with that being said, I'd like to pick apart some of the decks and what happened at the table. So let's start with Cole, we'll say. His deck, very impressive. I was very impressed by how many spells he was able to cast by just making an imp, sacrificing it, drawing cards, sacrificing it again, making another imp, making more cards. It really felt like a well-oiled machine, and I think that if he'd had just a couple more turns to be able to do all of that, and especially if he weren't giving his opponents free card draw with the Hivemind, he probably just winds up outvaluing the rest of the table and just kind of drowning the rest of us in card draw, and that's very impressive considering he was in a Rakdos deck. Moving on around the table, we get to Josh and his Hashaton deck. You may have noticed Josh was playing on Moxfield, so that is something you can do on Spell Table if you're interested. I know some people have mentioned that they don't have great setups for Spell Table. You can always just use Moxfield. It is a great and perfect way to go. But being able to test out a deck that he didn't quite have all the pieces for was also a nice benefit. And I will say Hashaton is absolutely absurd. Not exiling the card that you discard is wild. I can't believe that they didn't have it exile the thing it makes copies of, because that's what allowed Josh to discard the Massacre Worm, make a ton of tokens, and then even once it was destroyed, he could just pick it back up, discard it again, make more tokens, and just really go off, destroy his opponent's boards. It legitimately felt for a long time in that game like none of us could do anything to Josh. He was going to win. There was nothing we could do to stop it. And really the only reason that any of us had a chance is because I had that Aetherize in my hand. And if I hadn't had the Aetherize, he just runs me over. He wins, no problem. And then, of course, we have Doodle, whose deck also did very well in that game. It is kind of surprising to see someone go infinite 2 separate times and still not be able to win the game. But honestly, a lot of that was due to the Teferi's protection and also due to the Everybody Lives. I think this is the first time I've played a deck that someone cast Everybody Lives, and it really overperformed in a way that I didn't expect because of how many things it does in a game. It's definitely one of those cards that you cast when you have no intention of losing because you just can't lose the game. So I think that that was probably also Doodle's game to win. He just got a little bit unlucky, also kind of like Cole because of the Hive Mind. I think that if the Hive Mind hadn't existed, then Doodle probably just wins. He can very easily just continuously either Teferi's protection or Everybody Lives until he's able to win the game. But the Hive Mind kept us in long enough to be able to stand a fighting chance. And last but not least, of course, our deck. I was incredibly impressed with Riversong. I think she dealt a ton of damage over the course of the game. I think by the end of it, she had dealt 30 plus damage, which is way more than I expected. And being able to put us in a position where no matter what we did, we had ways to protect ourselves, we had ways to deal damage, we were drawing our opponents a ton of cards that they then could use to also inflict damage upon themselves because of Riversong. So overall, very impressed with the deck, very impressed with everything that went on. But let me know down in the comments if there's any cards you think we should add to the deck or maybe take out of the deck. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching. Please do like the video and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more. And as always, I will see you on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.